Okay, so here we are. We're in the Davis Mountains of far west Texas. We've had a really beautiful year. This is probably as good a year as I can remember seeing out here in 20 years that I've been here. You can just look at all the forage we've grown and it's still green and growing. So we want to talk a little bit today about grazing management and things we can look at and study on native pasture situations, which obviously are going to be quite different than in many regions of Texas and other parts of the world where we would have introduced plants and things like that. So I guess the main thing we talk about when we talk about managing native rangelands, whether we're talking San Angelo, Texas, or a true desert somewhere, or up here in the mountains, native rangelands are managed according to ecological principles, okay? And that means mainly what kind of animals we put there, what the stock density is of those animals, that is how many there are per acre, or out in this part of the world they usually measure them by the square mile, animals per square mile, and how long we leave them there. And those are really our tools to manage native pastures with, is grazing, and how we manage grazing and what kind of grazing systems we use. We have some other things in our toolbox which are kind of intermittent. We can use prescribed fire occasionally. It's just not something that we truly use a lot of this far west because of variable precipitation and things like that. But it can be incorporated on a small scale. But by far, our biggest thing that we use is grazing animals, grazing pressure. We use the animals with different maybe systems, hoof action and things like that, but it gets back to the animals. So there's that, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about maybe how we manage forage quantity in relation to animal demands and how we do all that to keep the ecosystem healthy. Because at the end of the day, out here we can't run a fertilizer tractor over this land, we can't irrigate it, we can't do anything to make up for what we might do mistakenly if we somehow either overgraze it by accident or through neglect. So at the end of the day, our main goal is to manage this kind of native pasture. We're talking about managing residue, what we leave behind ungrazed. That's going to control all the ecological processes that happen after that. Soil moisture, soil ecology, all of that stuff, soil erosion, especially soil erosion. So really we're managing grass residue and we're managing soil, okay? So we'll do some exercises here in a minute on how to estimate how much forage is out here, what time of year you want to do that, and how to kind of budget forage for livestock. Whether animals are standing around a hay ring somewhere eating hay, or whether they're out here in this native country, an animal is going to need about 2.5% of its body weight per day in dry matter intake, and that's going to be what they'll eat. Knowing that will help us budget forage and things like that. Some other things we'll talk about is just studying what we see out in the pasture. Studying grazing behavior in animals can tell you a lot. If I'm out here, and there's a few cows out here behind me, they're kind of just standing around. If we can look at them, and maybe we'll get some more shots of cattle later in some other frames, but it's the middle of the afternoon and it's cool. And if I were a grazing animal, I wouldn't mind being up eating right now. But that cow over there is not. And the reason she's not is she's probably already filled her belly up this morning. Now she may be bedded down under one of those trees, but if you go out in the middle of the day, and it's especially if it's hot and in the summer, and if you see animals up grazing in the middle of the day, they're probably hungry, and they should be able to fill their bellies up in the morning. Grazing animals, cattle particularly, have really two bouts of grazing, one in the morning and one in the evening, sort of bimodal. And that's when you want to see them up and eating. If you go out in the middle of the day and they're up eating regularly, you've probably got a little work to do. The other thing, we can look at animals, especially in big pastures. If they're really spread out, they're probably really looking for something to eat. If they tend to kind of herd up and group and graze in the early parts of the day in herds, that's another good indication that they're getting enough to eat, and you're probably doing at least enough to meet their dry matter requirements. So we talk about meeting animals' dry matter requirements. That is not the same thing as leaving forage behind, because an animal can meet its dry matter requirements off what we might want to leave behind to protect the soil. And to me, that's the definition of overgrazing. It's when we actually start asking those animals to meet their daily dry matter requirements after what we should be leaving behind to protect the soil in the rangeland.